Good morning. Today, as we read through the Bible, we're looking at Luke chapter 20, verses 1 through 26. And again, Jesus is in Jerusalem. It's that final trip for him to be there. The scribes and Pharisees are definitely on the alert. They're on the agenda of finding something against Jesus and anything and everything they can. And chapter 20 begins with Jesus teaching in the temple, telling the good news. And the chief priests and the scribes and the elders come to him and ask him, where do you get the authority to do this? Where do you get the authority to teach the way you do? Where do you get the understanding? Where do you get the wisdom? Where is all this coming from? And rather than give them an answer that, it came from God, my Father, no, he says, I'll ask you a similar question. And if you can answer it, then I'll answer your question. And he asks them, by what authority was John baptizing? Was it of human authority or of a heavenly authority? And these religious leaders all went and they debate among themselves. They talk about it and they come back, knowing that whichever way they answer, Jesus is going to catch them. Because if he says, if it's from heaven, well then, why don't you believe? And if it's from human authority, well then, what? But they simply come back, if it was from human authority, the people would be upset because the people definitely looked at Jesus as a prophet, as somebody, or at John the Baptist even too that way. And so they come back with this, we don't know, ignorant, and they're not going to give Jesus the benefit of the doubt. And then, when they come back, well, we don't know where the authority that John had came from. And so then Jesus, I'm not going to tell you where my authority comes from either. And think about authority. Who has authority in our lives? I mean, when we're kids growing up, of course, our parents do. Our teachers do. Police officers have authority. And but authority is earned. Parents by being parents, but sometimes we elect people to positions, and these people have authority. I think about within our churches, we elect, people to be or serve on our church council, and they have authority over how the church runs and what happens that way. And so authority is not something that we just have on our own, but it's granted to us, by some fact or other. And so Jesus says, where did John's authority come from? From heaven or from the people? And, by not answering him, they just, they pleaded ignorance. And then they go on. So then Jesus tells a parable about this owner of the vineyard who goes and leaves the vineyard in rented out, and he sends a slave to, get his share, when the time comes. And these people mistreat the slave. They beat him and send him on his way with nothing. And the second time a slave comes, and the third time a slave comes, and they just ignore the authority of that slave, because that slave has the authority from the owner. This is, Jesus is talking to these religious leaders about authority and where authority comes from. And then the third or the fourth time, the owner says, I will send my beloved son. Where do we get that beloved son? Think about John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But so the owner sends his beloved son, and what do they do to him? They plot and they figure, hey, if we get rid of him, it's going to be all ours. And so they kill this son. And these religious leaders understand that Jesus is talking about them, that they are rejecting the beloved son. How can they not see the evidence of Jesus, being the Messiah? But they just couldn't accept it. And so even when Jesus is telling them, and not all the Pharisees, not all the religious leaders are that way. And, I sometimes, don't always remember to mention that there were some that did look at Jesus as the Messiah, as truly the Son of God. But, they understand that. So verse 15, Jesus says, they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. And then he asks the question, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and he will destroy those tenants and give the vineyards to others. And the authorities, these religious leaders, they realize that Jesus is talking about them. But, they said, heaven forbid. And then he asked them, well, what does this text mean? So that was, the religious leaders this shouldn't be, that the owner would come and kill the tenants and give it to somebody else. And then Jesus says, well, what then does this mean? And then he quotes, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And it's, from the Old Testament that, the Messiah is going to come and he's going to be rejected. But this stone, Jesus Christ, the rock, is rejected by the builders. He becomes the cornerstone of the whole Christian church. He becomes the cornerstone of our faith today. And again, whoever falls on this stone will be broken. And again, the scribes, chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them. They wanted to lay hands on him. They wanted to arrest him. They wanted to throw him in the slammer. But they feared the people. They were aware that the people held Jesus in high esteem. Why wouldn't they? Look at all that Jesus had done. And yet these Pharisees, these religious leaders, the ones who should have embraced him and welcomed him and listened to him, choose to reject him. But they don't dare to do something because of the people. So they got to figure out, and they do, we all are aware of what they figure out, how to turn the people against Jesus. Verse 20, they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be honest in order to trap him by what he said. They're doing anything and everything they can. They got to find something against Jesus. So they send these spies to Jesus. And so it says, so that they may hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the government, the governor. And so then these spies ask Jesus the question, is it legal to pay taxes? And they butter him up to start with. We know that you are right in what you say and teach, and you show deference to no one. You're not prejudiced. You're not for somebody and against somebody, but anybody and everybody is welcome in your sight. You don't show no deference, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. So they butter him up with this, and then boom, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? The Roman government ruled this land of the Israelites, and they paid taxes, and the Israelites hated paying the taxes. And it's just, Zacchaeus, this wee little tax collector, man. He was hated and despised because he worked for the Roman government. So is it legal for us to pay these taxes, Figuring, well, if Jesus says no, they could turn him into the authorities because he's, an insurrectionist, leading a revolt against the government. And if he says yes, well then, he's showing allegiance to an earthly figure rather than just God. But Jesus is smarter than that. He's aware of what's going on. And hopefully you know the story. He says, well, show me a coin. Whose picture's on the coin? Caesar. And he says, give then to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And so then that asks the question, well, what in our life do we owe to Caesar, the government? And what do we owe to God? This is the age-old conundrum of what do we owe to our government and what do we owe to God. And I always feel that as a Christian, we are to be a good citizen of our government, because our government is there to protect us and to serve us, although sometimes they may not do that the very best, and sometimes we may disagree. But so hopefully, supposedly, the government is there to rule fairly for all people. So we support our government by being a good citizen. But we're not only a good citizen of our country, this earth, but we're also a good citizen of the kingdom of God. And so we serve God as best we can, better. And God is our number one priority. And if our government, if our country gets in the way of our relationship with God, it's just, these countries that forbid Christianity, forbid meeting as a church, those countries are putting themselves above God, and that's not right at all. And so, be a good citizen of our country, but above all, to be a good citizen of the kingdom of God, and be thankful always to Him. And, this last part we read today, they were not able in the presence of the people to trap Him, and they became amazed by His answer, and they became silent. So Jesus, shut them up. But in being able to answer them properly without getting in trouble, either way.